close of the 13th century, in the 1290s, England invaded Scotland. It was as a result of problems with the Scottish kingship, who was going to be king. And the English king, Edward I, took advantage of the situation to try and take over Scotland. And the wars that were fought against Edward lasted for the next 30 years or so and have gone down ever since as one of the most important periods ever in Scotland's history. Back then, life was very different than it is today because people didn't have shops to go to. They had to grow their own food. They had to raise their own cattle, their own sheep, grow barley and oats and sometimes wheat to make bread. And people lived in small communities, much smaller than even villages today, wee toons they were called. And these were scattered all over Scotland from the borders up to Inverness and Murrayshire on the northeast coast. The problems with England at the time had started in 1286 when King Alexander III fell off his horse in a storm on the way to Burnt Island to visit his queen. He fell down the cliff and died. And he had no heirs, he had no son to follow him. His closest living relative was brought up in Norway and she was known as the Maid of Norway. And unfortunately, when she was coming back to Scotland, she was drowned on board ship. And the situation then existed where there was no immediate heir to the throne of Scotland, and the problems began. In the wars against Edward I and his son Edward II, the greatest heroes of the Scots were William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Wallace came from obscurity to lead the Scots against the English, having many great successes against superior forces. In time, he was followed by Robert the Bruce, who, different from Wallace, had a claim to the kingship of Scotland. And once he had become King of Scotland, he showed himself to be an able pupil of Wallace, leading the Scots to eventual victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. William Wallace was truly a man of the people. He was not any kind of noble or baron. His father wasn't poor, but William was truly a Scot fighting on behalf of his own people. In his struggles against the English, he showed that he had an amazing grasp of tactics and of being able to inspire men. His use of spearmen in particular against English cavalry gave great many victories to the Scots.
One day, William Wallace was out fishing with his uncle and his cousin. They had been there for about an hour when some English soldiers appeared on the hill. One of them, a big soldier, came down the hill towards them. He didn't recognise William, and so he shouted,
"Oh, you! Give me those fish!"
But William replied,
"No, you're not getting any."
His uncle and his cousin were terrified and they pleaded with William.
"No, William, don't kill yourself for him. I don't want you taking these risks."
The soldier shouted,
"What did you say, you Scotch dogs?" "Well, you can have half of them."
The soldier rushed towards William, but William cleverly turned his rod and the fish hook caught the soldier right between the eyes. In an instant, William chopped off the arm of another soldier. The other soldier ran away in fear of his life.
"William!" "William, look! Look, there's his arm! He deserved it." "No. Oh no, William, why did you do it? I know that. Oh, we need to run away."
Eventually, William Wallace was betrayed. He was captured somewhere near Royston, put in chains and sent off to England. The trial was a farce. It was a show trial. There was a foregone conclusion that Wallace would be found guilty, and it was also a foregone conclusion that the sentence he would be given would be to be hung, drawn and quartered, a particularly nasty and sadistic way of killing anyone. First he was hung by the neck till he was almost dead, then he was cut down, disemboweled and had his intestines burnt on a fire before his very eyes. Once he was dead, his body was chopped up, his head cut off, and his head and parts of his body sent to various places in Scotland to be put on public display to try and discourage others from rising against the English. Robert the Bruce was a different kind of man entirely from William Wallace. He was a member of the nobility and from a very early age had been raised to appreciate his own position. His father had been a claimant to the throne, and in time Robert inherited this claim. He was a man who at various times was closely involved with Edward I, but in time, through the inspiration of Wallace and others, he began to realise that his true destiny lay in fighting against Edward I and becoming King of Scotland in his own right. The main weapon of the English army at the time was the armoured knight. These were men clad in chainmail with helmets on the back of big horses like modern-day Clydesdales, which also had armour on them. And the combined weight of the man and the horse could be nearly half a ton. And the Scots only had lightly armoured knights and much smaller horses. But what they did have, and what proved very effective in the hands of both William Wallace and Robert Bruce, was the spearmen who developed techniques to deal with these armoured knights of the English army. The Chautrins had been developed as a form of fighting against the English cavalry. They were generally circles of up to 1,500 men, all of whom were equipped with very long spears. The men were also trained to use these spears. One of the most important things that Bruce did was to retake Scottish castles. The most important of these at the time was probably Stirling Castle, and his brother Edward Bruce came to an agreement with the commander of Stirling that the commander would hand over the castle to the Scots if they had not been relieved by Midsummer's Day in 1314. Midsummer 1314, matters came to a head. Edward II had come north from England with an army of about 17,000 men, including 5,000 heavy cavalry. Against him, Robert the Bruce had about 4,500 to 5,000 men, which only had 500 cavalry. Robert the Bruce looked over the Battle of Bannockburn. He had dug pits. He had put calthrops on the ground to disrupt the English cavalry charge. He used the spearmen in a new way and attacked the English forces before they were even ready to fight. A mobile line of spearmen moved into the English army and drove them back from the field of Bannockburn. And as the battle itself was beginning to turn in the Scots' favour, a crowd of people came over the hills behind Bannockburn. The English, seeing them, thought this was new troops coming to reinforce the Scottish army, but it was the small folk, the local people from the area, who decided to lend a hand in this battle to defend their native soil. The English army was broken and routed from the field. The greatest fighting army of Europe at the time, routed by just a few thousand Scots. 6 years after the Battle of Bannockburn, the Declaration of Arbroath was created. This was originally a letter sent to the Pope on behalf of the Scottish nation to claim that they, as good Christians, were entitled to be their own nation and that they should not be continually attacked by the English. In the Declaration, it is declared not only that as long as 100 Scots are left alive, they will refuse to bow the knee to the English, but that if King Robert does not keep the English out, the people will find themselves a new king.